Alright, hi. So this is going to be a in-depth analysis of the lyrical themes of the song Two-Headed Boy by Neutral Milk Cartel. And as much as this album has been memed over like 10 years or something like that, I find that there is a lot of in-depth lyrics, that there's a lot of value to be extracted from these lyrics. I think these are very, very personal, very, very interesting lyrics. And I think I've accidentally stumbled upon an interpretation that not only kind of makes sense, but also is really meaningful in terms of illuminating the entire theme of the album. And yeah, so, brief context, you already know this, but it was released in 1998 by Jeff Mangum and Neutral Milk Hotel. The album was inspired by a reading of Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl. As Jeff said, he read the book randomly one day, and after he read it, he was inconsolable. He just couldn't. He was just so saddened that someone so young was taken away because of such evil in the world. And in the album, some themes that I recognize from listening to it like countless times are coming of age, sexuality, war, religion, death, and a lot of other stuff that he covers on Two-Headed, not on just Two-Headed Boy, but like on every single track on the album. And here's a brief thesis statement before I get into the nitty-gritty of what I want to analyze here. So Mangum's masterful usage of historical and religious allusions, metaphor, and double meanings serve to illustrate his deep connection with Anne Frank and the audience, as well as providing a profound commentary on the universality and power of personal expression throughout various artistic mediums. So initially that might seem a little bit confusing, but I'll get to it. Basically what you need to know is that Two-Headed Boy I think it is a song that is primarily about Anne Frank, even though many different interpretations seem to think of it differently, the Two-Headed Boy as a character, but we will move on to that. So here are some brief annotations that I did of the song while I was analyzing it. I have more detailed annotations of specific stanzas that I have chosen not to share because I think they would be too lengthy. But yeah, this was one of my initial like deep readings. And yeah, first of all, I'll share what I think this song is about. So I think there's a lot of different interpretations on the internet. So there was that one video where that English professor talked about the Two-Headed Boy being like this mutated fetus sort of thing that like is floating in a jar, and like it's very freak show-esque, very Coney Island-esque as he described it. And other people have a more abstract way of thinking about it. I've heard interpretations of like the Two-Headed Boy is a Jew who in some cases is friendly to Jews, but is also like a Nazi sympathizer or something like that. And there are of course there are a lot of different interpretations, and all of them depend on how you want to think about it. But that's not what I think. So a few things that I initially thought it was about. I thought the Two-Headed Boy might have been referring to Peter, who is the boy who lived with Anne in the annex when they were hiding, and Jeff Mangum, simultaneously. So this character of the Two-Headed Boy is a representation of both characters simultaneously. And as I read it, I guess that kind of made sense, but what I kept on like touching upon when I was repeatedly reading and analyzing these lyrics was a lot of these lyrics are about Anne Frank. And as I like sat with the lyrics more, I realized that these lyrics are simultaneously addressed to Anne Frank and addressed to Jeff himself. Well, this is a little bit confusing. So the way I interpret it is every single line, or close to every single line, most of the lines, they are written in a way that they try to relate to both Jeff and Anne's experiences simultaneously, even though, they live like 50 years apart. So but I think how Jeff is trying to connect with Anne through that framing and the character character, quote unquote, of the two-headed boy is really interesting. And yeah, we'll just get into it really quick. So, first verse. Two-headed boy, all floating in glass. The sun, it is past, now it's blacker than black. I can hear as you tap on your jar, and I am listening to hear where you are. I am listening to hear where you are. So, first of all, there's the interpretation that this is some fetus, malformed fetus that is sitting in floating in like a jar full of liquid or something like that, like very mad sciencey sort of thing. But I read this more metaphorically. So, two-headed boy, all floating in glass. And tap on your jar. I think that's a pretty clear metaphor for confinement, for like Anne, for example, in the annex. And I think that Jeff is particularly using the metaphor of the jar to illustrate Anne's confinement, and also, I am listening to hear where you are. I am listening to hear where you are. So Jeff is trying to connect with Anne Frank through reading her diary, through understanding her story. And the sun of this past, now it's blacker than black. I think this is a reference to death. I think there's a lot of references to Anne's death throughout this song. I think this is one of the most direct ones. And yeah, I think the first verse is Jeff trying to connect with Anne. But I also, and this is a bit of a stretch, but I think that this verse also talks about how Anne, when she was in Annex, there is a lot of auditory imagery in this song. So I am listening to hear where you are. There is a slight implication that listening to hear where you are could be Anne trying to connect to the outside world in some way, or trying to understand the world around her. And this is this is probably not like correct. I don't think anything I'm saying is correct per se, but I think there is an argument to be made that this verse is about both Jeff and Anne. And so in verse 2, this is where it really, really like becomes clear to me. And you see it. Two-headed boy put on Sunday shoes and danced round the room to accordion keys. So two-headed boy, again, I think he is referring to both him, Jeff Mangum is referring to both himself and Anne Frank. So put on Sunday shoes and danced round the room to accordion keys. Now, this might be me reading into it a little bit too much, but the use of the allusions of Sunday shoes and accordion keys. So Sunday shoes, obviously very Christian imagery, and Jeff grew up in a very Christian family. He went to Christian camp, although it was a bit more chill than regular, like, Jesus camp. And accordions were a very important instrument in Jewish classroom music, which I assume that was quite important to a lot of Jewish families living in Europe in the 1920s, 1930s. And so that juxtaposition of different traditions really plays into the overall theme of Jeff trying to speak to both himself and Anne. And dance around the room, put on Sunday shoes and dance around the room. There's also a bit of I'm not sure how to describe it, but there's a bit of a dichotomy of, it's usually like kick off your Sunday shoes and let's dance. Dancing around the room is like kind of a illusion, kind of a metaphor for a loss of innocence, a sort of coming of age, a sort of like a ritual that you perform when you grow up. With the needle that sings in your heart, catching signals that sound in the dark, catching signals that sound in the dark. Now, again, as I said, there's a lot of auditory imagery in this. So with the needle that sings in your heart, there's obviously the record. Like the record in the airplane over the sea, you play it with the needle if you have a vinyl copy. Also, a needle can also signify like a phonograph, which is something that Anne may have used. And catching signals that sound in the dark, catching signals that sound in the dark. So I can interpret this line many different ways. So there's the literal way, which is Anne is trapped inside the annex and she's catching signals from the radio that sound in the dark, because I assume that they had to keep their lights off. And interestingly, it was after Anne heard the Dutch government in exile on the radio who said that we as a people must keep a record of this like terrible time, of these atrocities, that inspired Anne Frank to edit her diary and make it more readable in case it like was read by people in the future, which it did turn out to be. And catching signals that sound in the dark, I think, also means Jeff trying to listen to Anne even from beyond the grave. So in the dark, probably maybe a reference to death. Signals is just a way of communication. I think Anne, through her diary, was trying to communicate with the outside world. She didn't really know that it would be so moving to so many people, but signals is, to me, a pretty clear reference, pretty clear metaphor to that. So, into the chorus, we will take off our clothes and they'll be placing fingers through the notches in your spine. So, this line is my favorite line in the song, and I feel that it captures so many things so vividly and so beautifully. And I'll just explain it. So, the first thing that you'll think of when you hear these two lines are, oh, this is like this is like sex. This is talking about some sort of sexual experience that maybe Jeff is having with Anne, although like I don't want to get carried away with like the memes and stuff like that. But I there is a lot of metaphor here. So we will take off our clothes. I interpret this line as taking off your clothes is a very vulnerable thing to do, right? So In the Aeroplane is a very vulnerable album. Jeff talks about his childhood, talks about trauma in his childhood, he talks about his religion with his faith, he talks a lot about death. It's a very personal album, even though it's not directly personal, and as in it doesn't like reference his own pains. It's still a very emotionally vulnerable and resonant piece of work. And Anne Frank's Diary, obviously, is a very vulnerable piece of work because I don't think she expected that many people to read it. And it's a diary is probably the most vulnerable thing that you can pour yourself into. And Jeff even said that like reading Anne Frank's diary, he was able to understand Anne Frank more than people that he knew in real life because of these thoughts that were so personal, very like private. And there's this unspoken connection through generations that Jeff feels with Anne when he sings "We Will Take Off Our Clothes." There's this belief in the universality of artistic expression, especially very deeply personal, vulnerable artistic personal expression, being a personal artistic expression, being very powerful in different artistic mediums, but still remaining very moving. And they'll be placing fingers through the notches in your spine. Dale is talking about us, about the reader of the diary or the listener of the album. And placing fingers through the notches in your spine, again, first of all, the thing you think of is a human spine. But there's also a spine on the record. There's also a spine on the diary. So there's a lot of like double meaning, a lot of metaphor that Jeff Mangum is using in this song. So the audience, us, we are placing fingers. We are trying to understand both Jeff and Anne through their respective mediums, and we are, as the audience, we are just like experiencing the emotions that they're so vulnerably expressing in their respective mediums. And when all is breaking, everything that you could keep inside. I think this is more a direct reference to Anne Frank. All is breaking, obviously World War II, the Holocaust, that you could keep inside. Keep inside, not a reference to her diary. Diary is very personal. You're keeping all your I wouldn't say secrets, but like all your very personal thoughts inside. Now your eyes ain't moving now. They just lay there in their climb. Now, your eyes ain't moving now, probably another reference to death. They just lay there in their climb. So climb is interesting as it doesn't really make sense grammatically in this context. First of all, I interpret this as maybe an allusion to heaven, but it doesn't really make sense. But then I thought maybe this could mean like climb, like CLIME, like a sort of like an environment. Because as later on you will see, Jeff uses a lot of words that can be read or heard differently based on like the cadence of the vocal delivery, which is actually quite interesting. And so on the surface, this line doesn't really make that much sense, but I think it's definitely a reference to Anne's death and the deep sadness that Jeff feels from it. And so we go into verse 3. And verse 3 is a little bit more confusing. So, two-headed boy with pulleys and weights. I don't know what pulleys and weights references. But creating a radio play for just two. So, I think radio play is... I think this stanza as a whole is a reference to Peter and Anne and their activities within the annex. But it's also more of a reference to Jeff's own musical process and the way he writes his music. So, creating a radio play for just two, it could be an activity. This is an activity that Anne may have done, or the radio play is the album, and Jeff is using his words as a way to kind of connect to those two. In the parlor with the moon across her face. Moon across her face, I think it's a reference to the album cover. It could also mean death, like being very pale in the face. This line is very cryptic. This stanza is like more cryptic than the last two. I think it's harder for me to make sense of this one. And through the music, he sweetly displays silver speakers that sparkle all day. So I think Jeff is talking about himself here. He is, through his music in the airplane over the sea, he is sweetly displaying his very vulnerable emotions and his feelings towards Anne Frank. Silver speakers that sparkle all day. Silver speakers, maybe a reference to the album. Again, I'm not sure. Made for his lover who's floating and choking with her hands across her face. So this is quite morbid, scary imagery. And so floating and choking. So there's choking with her hands across her face. Pretty clear reference to Anne's death again. Made for his lover. His lover probably refers to Peter. Peter, Anne and Peter did fall in love when they were in the annex for a brief moment. And floating, another reference to maybe a reference to religion, maybe a reference to heaven. And again, the second line of the song is all floating in glass. So and later in their climb, if you want to read it like that. So there are a few allusions to heaven in this song. And maybe they're floating in the airplane over the sea. I don't know. Again, this verse is very... there's a lot of mystical, very strange imagery in here. And it's, again, with this whole song, there is no perfect interpretation of it. It's a very dreamlike, very cryptic song. And I am trying to make sense of it. I think that there is a lot to be gained from deeply analyzing it. But I also have to recognize that this song is very cryptic. It's not... The meaning isn't like right there, and I don't even think there is like one meaning, but I think it's interesting to like look at like a few specific lines and like how they contribute to the theme as a whole. And now the final stanza. Two-headed boy, there's no reason to grieve. Jeff is probably talking about himself here. He's coming to the fact that Anne is dead. Anne has been dead for 53 years. And he shouldn't feel this deep depression and sadness that he felt after reading Anne Frank's diary. The world that you need, wrapped in gold silver sleeves, left beneath Christmas trees in the snow. Now there's a literal interpretation of this, which could be Christmas trees as like pine trees was something that the Nazis used to plan over concentration camps. But I think it's very unlikely that it's that. It could also be a reference to resurrection. Maybe Anne is coming back to life or something like that. I think again, these lyrics are quite cryptic. I think generally there's a tone of a kind of futile hope there. I think that's what this verse is trying to convey. And I will take you and leave you alone, watching spirals of white softly flow under your eyelids, and all you did will wait until the point when you let go. I messed up the lyrics here. It's over your eyelids. But spirals of white is either referring to snow or it's referring to the ashes of burned Holocaust victims, which is quite morbid. This whole thing is about that. This whole stanza slash verse is about death. It's about a acceptance with the very morbid side of death. But also at the end there is a little bit of hope. All you did will wait until the point when you let go. So all you did. That's probably a reference to Anne's life and her diary and like everyone she knew. So and it's a celebration of her life, and it's the belief that, and again I'll reference a lyric from another song, Ghost. Like it was like she will never die, and Jeff firmly believes that Anne Frank's story is something that we will never let go, and her story will wait until she's forgotten or something like that. And I think that's really like meaningful. And one more thing, you might be wondering why I think the two-headed boy is referring to Jeff, who is a man, and Anne Frank, who was a girl. And I think it is purposely abstract, but I think there is also the theme of reincarnation and resurrection. And again, you have Paul in 1945. Now she's a little girl. Now she's a little boy in Spain playing pianos filled with flames. Maybe Anne Frank was resurrected as a boy, as a man. Again, this is all speculation. I don't know what these lyrics mean. These are just some ideas that I'm throwing around. And yeah, to finally finish this very lengthy analysis, I'll end with the quote of "Soft, silly music is meaningful, magical." And Two-Headed Boy and In the Aeroplane is pretty silly music generally. It's kind of goofy, but it's also meaningful and it's also magical. It's something wholly unique and something that's made me appreciate what you can do with lyrics to such a great extent that I just find it wonderful and captivating. And yeah, thanks for watching.